Hey guys, so we're going to be going over kind of intro to World War II and the Holocaust to kind of get you guys started for our next unit, which is going to be on the novel Night, which is about the Holocaust. It's a first-person POV story about a young kid named Elie Wiesel who is taken to Auschwitz and kind of his experience throughout. Okay. So before the Holocaust, Germany was the first nation to achieve universal adult literacy, which basically means that every adult in Germany could read, which is an incredible feat, really. The United States isn't anywhere close to universal adult literacy. We have many adults who cannot read. And the fact that they did achieve that shows us that Germany was highly educated. They were, you have a hugely educated population. So this was not some like backwards, kind of uncivilized country. This was a first world nation, a world power, and in Western Europe. So I think a lot of times people, at least before this point, made the mistake that genocide was something that happened elsewhere. It was something that happened to other countries, often darker countries, and this isn't something that can happen in civilized nations like Western Europe or in the United States. And the truth of it is that it can happen anywhere, anywhere where you have hatred, anywhere where you have a leader that kind of makes those decisions, anywhere where you have bigotry, anywhere where you have discrimination. Germany was not special, even though they kind of thought they were. So the Jewish population in Germany was particularly kind of amazing. So Germany has won the Nobel Peace Prize more than any other country. And Jewish people in Germany have won a third of their Nobel Peace Prizes and half of their prizes in medicine. So it just tells you that as educated as Germany was as a whole, their Jewish population was very, very educated. They were highly educated. They were often on the wealthier side, and Hitler used that as a kind of a way to push his people into blaming the Jews for any issues that they had. Okay. So anti-Semitism is hostility or discrimination against Jewish people specifically, right? So we're going to see anti-Semitism, the word itself, throughout Night, but we're also going to see huge amounts of examples of it as well. So Hitler was the leader of the National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, that was in power in Germany during the time of the Holocaust. He was elected in a democratic election. And he wasn't necessarily shy about what he was going to do. I don't think he opened with, "I'm going to kill all of Europe's Jews," but he definitely was not shy about his anti-Semitism. It was well known that he was a giant bigot and a racist. And yet people voted for him anyway, because they liked the other things that he was saying. And more importantly, they gave him somebody else to be angry at. Germany after World War I is a very strange place to be. It's very, very poor. The Treaty of Versailles that closes out World War I was very punitive toward Germany. They had to pay their war debt in addition to all of the winners' war debts. So it was an impoverished country at this point. They weren't allowed to have a standing military. So all of these things led to a lot of Germans feeling angry about how they'd been treated over the last 30 years or so, 20 years. And Hitler basically told them, "This isn't your fault. World War I, not your fault. World War I was not the fault of the German people. It was somebody else's fault." And he gave them the Jews as a scapegoat. And that's powerful, right? That's something that makes people feel better, is when it's somebody else's fault, not their own. He was born in Austria in 1889. His father was deeply anti-Semitic. It's likely that's where he got it. He was anti-Semitic all throughout his youth, and it became an obsession for him, really. So he also fought in World War I, coincidentally. So he thought that there was a political, military, and biological threat from the Jewish people, right? So political threat means that he argued that there were too many Jewish people in power in Germany, in positions of power, and that they'd be pushing a Jewish agenda that would only benefit themselves and not the German people as a whole. The military threat was literally like armed Jews, which was absurd. That was in no way an issue. And then the biological threat is probably the most ridiculous. Basically, he thought that Jewish blood was inferior, and he thought that it was trying to poison German blood and weaken it, which is gross in every sense of the word. But it was something that kind of caught fire. People agreed with him, which is horrifying in and of itself. He was deeply popular with university students. Nazis effectively controlled campuses 2 to 3 years before they took over the entire country. And students are a good group to target because they're highly impressionable. This is their first time away from home. This is the first time that they are usually coming up with their own thoughts and that kind of thing. So if you can get to them early and catalyze them into the vote, it can be a really, really strong voting bloc. And it ended up being that for Hitler. These same students were the same ones to organize boycotts and mass petitions to force Jews out of their professions and government. So it started with passive ways of hurting the Jewish people, basically. So basically, they would get people to sign a petition asking for a Jewish store to be kind of moved out of town, or they would just refuse to buy there and force the shopkeeper out because they weren't making enough money. When that didn't work, then they would turn to forms of violence like throwing bricks through windows and defacing the property, and by using graffiti or painting or anything like that as a way to kind of bully these people into leaving. So 1935, we have the Nuremberg Decrees. So this is 4 years before the start of World War II. World War II doesn't start until 1939. And these began stripping the Jewish people of their basic rights and separating them from the population. This is also the time we have the first concentration camp open at Dachau. 4 years before the start of World War II, there are already open concentration camps. So the biggest thing that I can teach you about genocide is that it does not happen quickly. It does not happen overnight. It takes a lot of time, and it's incremental, right? So it's the frog in boiling water. If you toss a frog into a pot of boiling water, it's going to jump out because it's hot and it hurts it. If you put a frog into a pot of cold water and then slowly heat it, the frog will boil to death before it realizes anything is wrong. And that is basically what genocide does, is it finds ways to lull people into false sense of security, strips them of their basic rights little by little by little, and then swiftly moves to kind of end them. So by 1938, again, a year before the war starts, the economic power of the Jews has been completely destroyed and Jews are expelled from all schools. So these basic rights that they're stripping them of is lack of education. A lot of times curfews were mandated. They weren't allowed to travel. They weren't allowed to own gold or jewelry. They had to wear the yellow star. All of these things kind of keep them down. So by destroying the economic power of the Jewish people, it basically means that they have very little capital in terms of what they can do. If you don't have money, it's difficult to enact political change, right? That's a big reason why a lot of our politics is about money-making ventures and not about the impoverished, is because they have, money talks. So the fact that they didn't have any made it very difficult. These are just some pictures of the emptying of ghettos, right? You'll notice that a lot of these children are very young. You'll notice that these people are carrying a lot of their belongings and things like that. These were often people that were being moved to transport. So they were living in ghettos, which were communities that were created within the city that to house the Jewish people while they kind of kept them in one spot. And then they would move them later, right? And here you can see them in a concentration camp. These were iconic, these striped jumpsuits or these striped uniforms. And you can see they're far too big for these children. So this was a children's concentration camp. You can also see that generally these people were largely richly dressed. You can see this woman's wearing really nice clothing. They're carrying their stuff. And we have these very small children and all these armed guards around them. I imagine the emptying of these ghettos was a terrifying experience, just not knowing where you were going. So in 1939, all unemployed Jews are pushed into forced labor, which is most of them, because you run them out of their ability to have shops and things like that. They can't own property. They can't have money. They or gold or jewelry. They're not allowed to go to school. So you have a lot of unemployed people. So Germany kind of like created an unemployed population. They said, oh, we have to do something with them. So they moved them into forced labor. And it looks like a good thing that you're doing. It looks like you're trying to put them to work, when in reality, you're the ones that caused them to not have work in the first place. By 1940, all allowances for Jews are abolished by law. So before this point, if you were particularly powerful, or if you had friends that were particularly powerful, there were possibilities that maybe you could still go to school, or maybe you were still allowed to have your shop open or whatever. But by 1940, period, if you were known to be a Jewish person, then all those allowances were gone. By 1941, all Jews aged 6 and up are forced to wear the Star of David on all their outer clothing. And again, it was just a way to be able to pick people out, right? That's a Jew, that isn't, which is a dangerous thing, right? And then, we have the movement into the Holocaust, the final solution, which was the idea that he was going to work the Jews to death. They were going to work for the Nazi war machine so that they could win World War II. So Germany created 1,600 concentration camps and over 900 labor camps. Labor camps were generally for prisoners of war or for kind of political dissidents, while concentration camps were for but yeah, these are mostly for prisoners of war, so or occupied countries. So if you were in France while it was being occupied by the Nazis, you might be sent to a labor camp. Concentration camps were for generally for Jewish people, homosexuals, the disabled, both mentally and physically, gypsies, and political dissidents, communists were sent to concentration camps. And these were concentration camps were generally significantly worse than labor camps. They had 6 death camps: Auschwitz, Chelmno, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Belzec. Auschwitz is the one that we're the most familiar with, obviously. It's the most notorious one. And basically these were just factories to process and kill as many people as possible. They did that in a multitude of ways. They would do it through gas most often because they found that to be the most efficient form, but they weren't above burning people in the crematoria alive sometimes, or shooting, having kind of mass shooting where they would, after they forced them to dig their own graves. So before the Holocaust, there were 8.9 million Jews in European countries that were either directly or indirectly under Hitler's control. The Nazis killed about 6 to 6.5 million people during the Holocaust, 6.5 million Jews, which is about 70% of Europe's population. So if his plan was for 100% extermination, he came very, very close. Over these, 6-7 years. In Poland, a country that was invaded very early on in the war and didn't have very much forewarning about what was going on, 90% of their Jewish population was killed. In Lithuania, the country my grandmother is from, 100% of their Jewish population was killed during the Holocaust. So, people doubted Hitler's ability to do this, and they were 100% wrong. So you'll notice several things about these images, which are hugely upsetting. One is how emaciated all of these people are. They were working them to death, so feeding them wasn't really that important. And emaciated people who've been starved, are weaker and less likely to try and attack you. Ellie, the Wiesel, the narrator of the novel that we're going to be reading, talks many times about how food was the most important thing in the world to them. It was all that they thought about, because when your body is literally eating itself, that's why these people are so emaciated, is because your body is eating your muscle mass because there's nothing else for it to run it. Then that's all you can focus on. Every time you try to think about something else, your stomach's growling or you're doubled over in pain because of how hungry you are. So they would keep them basically right on the brink of starvation and work them for as long as they could. You'll also notice all of their heads are shaved. Part of that is a dehumanizing process. It makes everybody kind of look the same. It strips you of your identity. Which is important both to make you feel like you're less than human, but also for your guards. If all of them just kind of look like the same skinny guy with no hair, then it's very easy for them to not form any bonds with them. You'll also notice the kind of careless way that these bodies have been dealt with or disposed of, right? These, again, to the Nazis, weren't people. They didn't see them as such. So treating their bodies with respect after they killed them would have been ridiculous. It would have been like burying a cockroach to them. It's just not necessary. Here you can see, so this probably would have been a member of the SS or the Einsatzgruppen. And you can see that we have a woman sheltering her child from being killed. So the Holocaust is a story of many, many countries ignoring what was happening to the Jews, including the United States. The United States has a terrible story. There was a cruise ship carrying, it was called the St. Louis, and it was carrying hundreds of Jews from Europe who were fleeing what was happening in Germany. And they tried to dock in the United States, and the United States turned them away. And we found out later that the vast majority, I think 70–80% of the people that were on those cruise ships ended up dying in the Holocaust because the United States refused to give them refuge. So most of the world just kind of turned a blind eye about what was going on. But there are some kind of glowing exceptions. So in Berlin, the capital of Germany, the probably most dangerous place to ever house a Jew, several thousand of the city's Jews escaped by going underground with the help of non-Jews. These were people who had Jews as their neighbors or their friends or whatever, and did not buy the propaganda of their country and put themselves in huge danger in order to try and save them, right? The Diary of Anne Frank, which you guys might be familiar with, is a similar story to this, though it ends much more tragically because Anne Frank and her family are found. But harboring a Jewish family when you weren't Jewish was so dangerous. You ran the risk of being killed immediately or being sent to a concentration camp and dying there. So you were putting yourself at great personal risk to try and help these people, which is incredible that even anyone did it. Because I imagine in Berlin, it would have been very easy to just turn your back on those people and ignore them. Denmark had some forewarning about what was happening as Germany was invading, and they managed to save the majority of their Jewish population by smuggling them to Sweden in fishing boats. So these are boats that shouldn't carry more than like 5-6 people at a time, and they literally just kind of pushed them across the bay and got them into Sweden where it was safer. Because they just would not allow Germany to do what it had done to Poland, where 90% of their Jewish population was killed. And then Oskar Schindler, one of the most amazing examples of this, he was a high-ranking German official. He was a Nazi, and he ran a labor camp. And he claimed that he was doing all of the things the Nazis asked him to do, but in reality, it was a haven. It was a refuge. And he saved over 1,000 Jews over the course of the war at huge personal risk. I can't imagine what the Nazis would have done if they had found out that somebody like Oskar Schindler, who was so high up in their operation, was working against them and saving Jews right from under their noses. There's a movie about him called Schindler's List, which is incredible, and about kind of what he did and how he helped these people. All right. So we're going to be continuing on with the Holocaust and diving right into night. So make sure you're reading. Deeply important that you're reading as we go through. All right, guys. See ya.